Listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to another National Road Safety Partnership Program webinar. Safer vehicles, safer roads, how are your people getting to work? My name is Jerome Carslake and I manage the NRSPP and its many activities. So to find out more, please visit the NRSPP website and register for our newsletter and you'll be kept up to date all the way through. Today's session will go for approximately 60 minutes with plenty of time for discussion throughout. We'll be recording this session and it will be shared on the NRSPP website, and there's a great thought leadership piece, and you'll also find out about the survey which we're going to be touching on, which you can take away as well. As with all of our webinars, we love your input, so please send through your questions, type them into the boxes you can see right here, and what I'll do is I'll pose them to our to Mick as we're going through. We have a couple of hold points, and if it's great at the time, I'll jump on in. So we're really lucky to have Mick Timms joining us today and sharing his wisdom. Just to let you know, Senior Sergeant Mick Timms is a member of the New South Wales Police Force, and he's been there since 1987. So he has over 32 years experience in road policing and held a range of operational and management positions. Mick coordinated national drink, drug driving and heavy vehicle operation. He holds a Bachelor of Professional Studies in Policing from UNE and majoring in road safety, so kindred soul there. He's also completed the Murak Road Safety Leadership Program in 2016. He's very generous about knowledge sharing and has presented 10 road safety papers on road policing, work health and safety, level crossing in Australia and overseas conference. And I also learned he's also gone head to head with good old Lawsies in a Albury radio interview as well. So great claim to fame. We have a fantastic person on board. Over to you, Mick.
Yeah, thanks, Jerome, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining in on this session. This project represents a health check on the safety of vehicles that are privately owned and driven by 1,400 employees and their families. And it also delves into the understanding of vehicle safety amongst those 1,400 employees. The 1,400 people that we're talking about happen to be police officers as well as civilian staff that work for my organisation, the Traffic and Highway Patrol Command. We're the lead command for traffic enforcement in New South Wales. Our study group of this project included Highway Patrol, Crash Investigation Police, as well as technical and support staff from throughout our command. So it was a diverse group of people that took part in it. Traffic and Highway Patrol Command, we have police officers stationed at about 70 locations throughout New South Wales. We have a highway patrol fleet which consists of well over 500 vehicles, and those vehicles do something like 25 million kilometres each year. So to put that into perspective, that's the equivalent of 36 return trips to the moon every year being carried out by our highway patrol vehicles. As you know, work health and safety legislation does impose a duty on organisations to ensure the health and safety of our workers, and quite a startling statistic from Safe Work is that road crashes are the biggest cause of worker deaths in Australia. For this reason alone, all of our patrol cars that we operate as a command must be 5-star ANCAP rated. If you haven't seen this slide before, it represents the 4 pillars of the safe systems: safer roads, safe speeds, safe people and safe vehicles. The 4 pillars of the safe systems are of equal importance. There's basically been an acknowledgement globally amongst road safety experts in the past few years that rather than trying to eliminate all crashes, the safe systems accepts that people do make mistakes and that crashes will occur. However, the outcome of those crashes shouldn't have to cost someone their life or leave somebody in hospital with life-changing injuries. We have to recognise that road users are error-prone and they can be physically vulnerable. The most common fatality in New South Wales represents a vehicle either running off the road, striking a fixed object such as a tree or a pole, or having a head-on crash. So if we take that example of a potential crash, let's say it's on an undivided country road, if that driver is driving a 5-star rated vehicle, if they're wearing a seatbelt, if they're travelling at a safe speed, and we have a safe road whereby the vehicle can impact with infrastructure such as a wire rope barrier, that means the vehicle won't hit a tree, it won't cross the centre line, it won't impact with a vehicle travelling in the opposite direction. And what would have resulted before in a death or a serious injury that can be reduced in severity just to a tow-away crash. That's if all those four pillars of the safe system are working together. Today we're going to talk about safer vehicles primarily, but just remember, if you do ignore speed limits or you're not wearing seatbelts, the safest vehicle in the world mightn't necessarily save you if you hit a tree.
And do you think over your 32 years, Mick, that's been a key thing that's you've seen change in your policing, that safe system approach?
It is a big change, and particularly on rural roads, it's quite amazing. I can just remember the times where I've served a lot of time in the country, in regional areas of New South Wales, and you could have a clear area, but somehow or other somebody's managed to whack a tree, and the consequences have been quite severe. So if we can reduce, if we can put wire rope barrier, if we can have protection at the roadsides, if we can have safer vehicles, if people slow down, that will make a difference towards achieving that goal of zero road deaths and serious injuries. So here's an example of the safer vehicles pillar. We have a rear end crash which occurred involving one of our highway patrol vehicles some time ago. So the vehicle, the police vehicle and also the civilian vehicle both happen to be 5-star rated vehicles. So in days gone by, and what Jerome was just touching on, we would have had a whiplash injury, we may have had even a spinal board, that type of thing. But because the vehicles are 5-star rated and they've absorbed the kinetic energy from that crash, and it's all about taking out the speed out of the equation and just reducing that kinetic energy from these crashes. So this is just a tow-away collision, which could have been, in days gone by, much more severe.
You've probably got a very embarrassed Suzuki driver, I would envisage, as well.
Oh, very embarrassed, very embarrassed. Their pride would have been hurt. I'm not sure if we can record that on the form as an under injury, but we move on. So I suppose how this project came about was Bernard Carlin, who was the Executive Director of the Centre for Road Safety in New South Wales. He came along to a road policing conference that we had in 2017, and he produced this statistic that only 1/3 of all light vehicles on New South Wales roads are 5-star ANCAP rated. And to put that into context, at the moment there's about 4.5 million passenger vehicles rated on the roads in New South Wales. So to have 2/3 of those vehicles as 4-star, 3-star or no star, it's fairly alarming. As far as government's concerned, we're fortunate. Government fleets such as the Highway Patrol, due to leasing and other procurement arrangements, we're generally turning our vehicles over a lot quicker, and that assists us and also a lot of private companies that have similar arrangements. That does assist in turning over vehicles and having vehicles with the latest technology. But I suppose the question that you need to look at is, it's okay for government fleets, but where does that leave the private vehicle owner? We have, as I said, we have 1,400 people in our command, and if you look at partners, husbands, wives, children, the private vehicle fleet that those employees own would represent well over 2,000 vehicles. That's a huge vehicle fleet. Probably think of the number of workers in your own organisation. Go out and have a look in your car park and have a look at the number of vehicles that are parked there and the diversity of those vehicles. If anyone should know about the importance of safer vehicles, it really should be police. We're the first responders. We're dealing with these incidents, road trauma, on a daily basis, so we do get to see firsthand the aftermath. So we asked the question: do the vehicles that our people have in their private day, do they have the highest level of occupant protection? And do our officers have sufficient knowledge of this pillar of safer vehicles, so that when they're going about buying their next vehicle, are they sufficiently informed about the importance of safer vehicles, not just for themselves, but also for the vehicle that their young kids are buying? And that's the first question point.
Yeah, it's great. So we've got a question here from Samantha going, in your senior leadership, how did you engage the conversation around safer vehicles and the cost of having those vehicles?
We'll talk about cost a bit later. Can we just hold that point, because I do go into the cost of vehicles a bit later. But in terms of, sorry.
No, for the organisational point of view, how did you make that point into your leadership? I think is what Samantha's asking.
And we'll touch on that a bit later as well. Don't let me escape it, but obviously we have 1,400 people, we have 500 odd vehicles. Driving is our business. Exposure is still the biggest biggest element in terms of risk of road trauma. So if you're exposing your people to that level of risk, you really have to put them in the highest level of protection. If you don't, it's your whole work and health and safety systems are flawed.
And I've got an interesting question here from Thomas as well. I know you'll be exploring this a little bit further on, but is this 5-star rating the one that is applied at the time of purchase, as this changes vastly depending on the year of assessment?
Yeah, look, it's a good question, and ANCAP have struggled with this over the years, because what was a 5-star rated vehicle a few years ago might not necessarily meet that threshold if it was tested today. I suppose it's not necessarily apples with apples, but there was some consideration of ANCAP whether they would introduce a 6th star, just for stuff like the autonomous emergency braking and lane departure warning, all that new technology which wasn't invented 10 years ago. But it is something, I suppose, when you're looking at buying a used car, the best thing you can go by is the used car guides, and if it was tested 5 stars at the time, or it continues to be considered 5 stars.
And a good question here from Paul. I think this just touches on what we were actually discussing a little bit earlier before we started the webinar, Mick. Where do your motorbikes and bicycles come into the safer vehicles and safer roads component?
Yeah, motorcycles are a unique feature for us, because obviously we don't have 5-star rated motorbikes, but what we do in terms of our motorcyclists is we make sure that we look at their protective clothing, and we start to look at those type of aspects. We've not long ago replaced our pants, and we actually have to go through that process again because the supplier is going to be ceasing to import that product. So we're now faced with a situation that we have to look at our pants, and we're actually looking at jackets as well. But in terms of motorcycling, there's a new website called MotoCap, which is a conglomerate of all the transport agencies throughout Australia who have come together, and it's basically ANCAP for motorcycles. So they've looked at helmets and jackets and pants. They've looked at this whole issue of protective clothing, and they're calling on manufacturers to submit products for ranking in terms of safety and comfort, wearability. So that's our next step. Whenever we'll be purchasing clothing in future for our motorcyclists, we'll be looking at it in terms of MotoCap, even if we need to organise the testing of products ourselves.
And just the last question here from Clarence, and you may or may not be able to answer this one before we move on. Is there any stats to prove that 5-star ANCAP vehicles significantly reduce accidents or fatalities?
Oh, big time. It's extremely significant. A few years ago, we had. I was going to save this for later, but I'll plug it in now. A few years ago, we had a pretty bad season for our Christmas for our Christmas holidays. It was the 2017-18 Christmas holiday period. 31 people died on New South Wales roads the Christmas before last. It was the worst holiday period we had. But then when we had a look at the vehicles that were involved, the average age of the vehicles in which people died in those crashes was 14 years old. And of those vehicles, only 2 of them were ANCAP 5-star rated. So we had vehicles that were made in the early 2000s, 1980s, 1990s that were having those run off road, those hit tree, those head-on crashes, and people were being killed in them. It's like people that don't wear their seatbelts. Wearing a seatbelt might not save you every time, but you've got to give yourself a chance. And if you're not in the safest vehicle, the odds of being seriously injured or killed, they mount.
And just expand on that a little bit further, because I know if you get a vehicle that has AEB, for example, I know a number of companies are moving to that, because if you actually analyse their data and there's a percentage of their workforce is rear-ending other vehicles, that takes that portion out. And I know the stats can look at reducing 25% of fatalities or injuries in that case straight away. Yeah,
that's right. And of course, if you're working in environments with high pedestrian traffic, that's the autonomous braking is very important.
So we have quite a few other questions that have come through, but I'll hold them through to the next point. Back to you, Mick.
Righto. Methodology. I'm going to find my place again. So, as I said, we have people that spread out throughout the state. So if we're running any type of survey, the best way for us to do it is electronically. So I devised a SurveyMonkey platform. We had 10 questions which were the respondents could select from predefined answers, and that was done primarily to limit free text, so it just helps your analysis if you can cut down on free text. The last question we posed, we asked people if they wanted to share any personal experiences in terms of safer vehicles that might shed some further light on the subject. It was only open for a few weeks. We didn't offer any prizes or rewards for people to take part. In the end, we had about 172 responses all told. That represents about 20% of our workforce at any one given time, allowing for absences. So I was fairly happy with the response. Pleasingly, we found that 57% of the survey respondents said that they did drive a private vehicle that was 5-star rated. Remembering back to what Bernard Carlin said, only 1/3 of the general vehicle fleet was 5-star, so we were pretty much double what the general public were doing. At least one vehicle in the family was 5-star rated, and significantly, the children, where our workers have children, in 61% of the households, the children usually drive a 5-star rated vehicle. Now, why do I ask about children? Well, our 2016 data says that drivers in the first 3 years of their license, so when they have their provisional license in their first 3 year, those young drivers they only account for 8% of all license holders, but they represent 15% of all fatalities. So young drivers are still overrepresented in fatalities. And that's despite significant improvements that we've made in the last decade or so since the introduction of the graduated licensing system in New South Wales. It used to be a whole lot worse as far as novice drivers was concerned, but it's still something that we need to factor in. In 82% of cases, vehicle safety was a factor in deciding what car to buy. We were very happy with that. I know we talked about cost. 30% of our respondents said that cost is a barrier in purchasing newer and safer vehicles. Only 3% said that they were not concerned about vehicle safety. I suppose I could turn that around and say that 90% of our people were concerned. But even that 3% figure is a little bit worried. We've still got some room to make up. And if you think of 3% of our force compared to 3% of the general population, that could be quite significant if it was extrapolated further. I'll quickly run through some of the full responses. I won't go through line by line. You can see these as I run through, but I'll just try to hit some of the points. As far as those that responded to our survey, Highway Patrol, they obviously make up the largest number of our command, and that was why there was the largest number of respondents. I didn't ask about public transport. The reason I didn't ask about it was a lot of our workers are rotating shifts. They start early in the morning, they finish late, and the private car does remain the dominant form of transportation for our workers. But depending on where other businesses are, they may wish to explore the use of public transport as a transport option. We were fortunate to receive a paycheck every fortnight. I did check my bank account. I did get paid on Tuesday again, which is good. And that probably reflects the relatively low age of the private vehicles that our people have. The average age of the Australian vehicle fleet in general is 10 years. So when you see quite a significant number of people have vehicles that are less than 12 months, 12 months to 3 years old and so forth, and only a quarter of our people are basically having vehicles that are 10 years or older. So the average age of our vehicles, in terms of the average age nationally, we're not doing too bad. Almost 1 in 5 respondents said that safety was not a factor that determined their purchasing decision. And as I was similar to what I said in the previous, if a quarter of our people don't consider safety when they're buying a vehicle, that would if you extrapolate that to the wider community, then that is quite a lot of people. So again, we have some work to do, although overall we weren't too displeased with what we found. In terms of 5-star vehicles themselves, you see there the number of people that rate their vehicles as 5-star or 4-star or lower, and the second question 6 about how many in the household are 5-star rated. We did provide our respondents with links to the new car ratings, which are on the ANCAP site, and the Centre for Road Safety has a has a page on their website where you can actually find out the ratings for used cars, which is quite extensive. As you see, there are only 15% of people didn't know what rating their vehicles were. So yeah, obviously you can find this information out generally if you look for it. The next question, we did talk about the impediments, some of the people as to why they didn't own 5-star vehicles. Now, we're in the highway patrol. We like our cars. A lot of our people have performance cars. We factored that in. What I was sort of struck by was the 56% of people that had a reason that I didn't really think of as to why they didn't have a 5-star car. So if we were doing this survey again, I'd probably consider a free text field just to try to capture some more of those reasons. If we start to look at, we started to look at novice drivers in this survey as well, which is pretty important as far as safety is concerned. The majority of our people actually didn't have children of driving age, but of those that did, 80% of them have had a discussion about safety with their driving age children. And as I said before, 61% almost or mostly drive a 5-star rated vehicle. In hindsight, I would have liked to have asked about the rate of public transport use amongst novice drivers. And that's because using public transport is certainly a way to mitigate crashes amongst novice drivers. If they're on a train, they're not going to be involved in a vehicle crash, are they? But then again, I suppose that does bring other issues. A parent's going to be happy about their kids riding the trains at 12 o'clock at night. One of the questions we asked, the free text question, we did ask people about what if they could bring anything else to the table about this. I'll just read you something that one of our respondents said. I have a teenage daughter learning to drive and purchasing a car. The current cost of living plays a significant factor in purchasing a vehicle for young adults. Most families have no other option than to simply purchase a vehicle that they can afford. I'm sure there's probably plenty of people listening that would share that sentiments. And then we pray each night that nothing happens to them. Rhetorically, the person went on to say that the cheaper option is a motorcycle, but let's look at crash statistics and motorcyclists. So even amongst our people, and we are reasonably well paid, as I said before, we do get a paycheck every fortnight, and we're probably above average in terms of weekly earnings. But even for our people, they do cite things like electricity prices and the running costs of vehicles as being impediments as to why they haven't gone out and bought safer vehicles.
And I find that quite intriguing. Just quickly before I dive into some of the many questions we've got, do you think because your workforce is at the coalface and you see road trauma, do you think it's naturally that they're more aware of having that conversation? When you said 80% are engaging youth?
Look, I think we're certainly at the coalface. People like police, ambulance officers, people in the fire brigade, even tow truck drivers, we see road trauma. We are dealing with the aftermath of it, and then obviously people in hospitals that have to deal with people who get brought in injured as a result of crashes. So there's no doubt that sometimes when you bring your work home with you and you have that discussion around the dinner table or what have you, this issue of being involved in crashes would no doubt come up amongst our people, and that's probably reflected in our statistics.
Okay, that's very interesting, isn't it? And how hard is it, do you think, to engage or get the youth to have a discussion around safer cars?
Yeah, look, I suppose it's like a lot of things that parents have to deal with nowadays as to whether their kids are getting too much screen time, or then we get the whole issue about the impact of drugs and things like that. It's very hard for parents. There's a lot that parents have to confront. Safer vehicles is just one thing, because now this is freedom for kids. They're off and they're running and they've got their vehicle. They can go out and they're the masters of their own destiny. Funny, I was reading an article recently in the Wall Street Journal, and it was encouraging children to ride your bike, go out and ride your bike, and go and explore different suburbs, and I suppose that's really the first taste of freedom. I suppose if you give them their first taste of freedom behind the wheel of a car, then perhaps bad things are more likely to happen.
Creates the habit. And I think it's a good segue here from Corey. In your many years of experience, would you say the epidemic of distracted driving presents the greatest risk at the moment?
Distracted driving is certainly something that has emerged in recent times, and it's not just it's not just things like phone. There's features now that are available in vehicles in the US where you can download apps and order fast food through. Oh yes, I'm going to go to that restaurant. I'll just jump on the app here, which integrated into your car dashboard, and I can order my food. And so it's just the types of distraction continue to expand, and it has emerged. We know that distracted driving is a leading contributor to road trauma and serious injury outcomes. And it's certainly that, I suppose, in a lot of regard, the genie's out of the bottle. We do our very best in terms of enforcement. We use a lot more. We use motorcycles quite heavily now to enforce that, because just the way that they're a little bit higher, you can see into vehicles, and we can detect people a lot more. But we don't want to be detecting people. It's Commissioner Scipione used to talk about not being able to arrest our way out of every problem. And it's probably distracted driving is probably something that we're not going to be able to book our way out of. We'll certainly continue to enforce it as best we can, and continue to look at other methods. But we really need the community to realise and accept that distracted driving is a risk, and just to put that phone away.
So I guess it's sort of looking backwards a little bit. It's a bit like that drink driving. When people used to drink quite a bit, it wasn't until we got culture change when it was sort of viewed not cool to drink anymore behind the wheel.
Well, that's right. It was a huge culture shift, the introduction of random breath testing, where we saw 1980 and the end of 1982 were introduced in New South Wales, and 1983, the first whole year, we had 500 fewer people killed on our roads. So it's made a tremendous impact. It is socially unacceptable to drink and drive, but we still have 20-odd thousand people a year charged in New South Wales with drink driving offences. We have to continue to maintain the rage in terms of enforcement of drink driving, and continue the general deterrence of programs such as random breath testing to make sure that those people that might waver on a Saturday night, gee, I might be able to drive here. Well, you got to make sure you have that plan B, and if you plan to drink, then plan not to drive. It's just one of the major challenges that we continue to have. It makes the job interesting.
I think it's an interesting point is when you go back to the distraction in the vehicle, because I remember I was part of a ING test the vehicle day, and they're looking at all these different ones. And one of the elements I remember I took when I was sort of driving those vehicles is I was plugging them in, mobile phone, just seeing what happened with the technology. And several of these cars, I'd plug it in, and on the dashboard, up would come my email, my Twitter feeds, my Facebook, texting and all that. And you could do that whilst you're driving along. Is that actually legal, Mick?
Well, you can't use any function of the phone. They talk about using cradles and so forth, but it is an offence in New South Wales if to use any function of the handheld mobile phone when you're driving. So it's not just talking or texting; it's looking at maps and other things. That's still a function of the phone.
And that's the crucial part of choosing the right vehicle at the beginning. So Dan Hill is asking a question for you looking at that. Are all police vehicles already 5-star, such as your paddy wagons? Is the process to phase these out of the fleet, or how do you upgrade them and keep them in the 5-star area?
Yeah, look, a lot of those cage truck vehicles, they have moved with the times, and now they have a fairly broad range of vehicles. I think they're using Colorados, and they use Rangers, and they're 5-star vehicles. We have an exemption under the road rules in terms of conveying passengers in the backs of vehicles, and that's something that obviously we can't move away from, because if you start putting seatbelts in the backs of vehicles, then you'll, without going into too much, you may start to introduce other hazards.
Trevor here's got a good question. Is there any data analytics regarding what ANCAP rating 18 to 24-year-old vehicles are buying? I know you're going to be talking about this a little bit later on. What's your thoughts?
Well, I suppose it's something that we just have to rely anecdotally and just keep spreading the message that if you do have younger children, the temptation is to put the younger children in the least expensive vehicle, and that's really not what we want. You really need to put your children in the safest vehicle.
And it's a really difficult one, isn't it? Counterintuitive. I can't let them drive my good car. I've got to put them in the crap car. But how precious are your kids to you?
That's right.
Question here from Robert. In addition to distraction, are there concerns regarding some of the inherent safety features in vehicles could be leading to changes in driver behaviour, creating an over-reliance on the safety features, such as autonomous braking?
Yeah, there's an organisation called Consumer Reports in the US, and they're basically the equivalent of our Choice. They've been doing quite a lot of work in the US, and they're asking people that have newer vehicles, how do you actually on a day-to-day basis, how do you actually find these safety features? Are they annoying? Are you turning them off? And there's a lot of work that will probably need to be done in that space in terms of, it's all very well having the latest safety features, but if drivers find them annoying, they might start to turn them off. Like the example that they posed was push bike riders. So we have the metre rule in New South Wales and in other jurisdictions where you have to give push bike riders at least 1 metre, depending on the speed zone that you're in. So if you veer a little bit more to the centre of the road, if you've got lane keeping assist, you'll get a warning that you're going to the centre of the road. But you're going to the centre of the road because you're trying to give the bicyclist more room. So there's a little bit of a juxtaposition there of legislative requirements versus vehicle safety. So they're issues that, as we move forward towards higher levels of autonomy, they're issues that that industry will have to work through.
That's great. So here's a good one from Steve as well, just drawing on that a bit more. As the newer cars become more refined, traveling at 100 kilometers per hour makes it much more comfortable, which can mask the consequences of minor errors of judgment, i.e. speed-related instances. Should we look at engine speed restrictions or similar to trucks, buses, etc., as the cars become more safety capable?
Well, I suppose that's probably on someone that at a higher pay grade than me to look at. It is interesting, and I did talk about earlier that you can have the safest vehicle, but if you start if you travel too fast, then you can pretty much override those safety benefits. And it's one of the challenges that engineers have. If you do make a roadway safer, then the tendency may be for people to want to drive faster. There's a lot of work being done in the area of intelligent speed adaptation and having vehicles travel at a certain speed. And I suppose ultimately, with connected vehicles and autonomous vehicles, they will recognise the speed zone and they'll travel at those speeds accordingly. But we're a long way from that yet, so the reliance is still on the motorist to make sure that they comply.
And it's got an interesting question here from Thomas before I move on. Do you think there's any aspect of complacency and desensitisation amongst police officers along the lines of, that wouldn't happen to me or my wife because I know to pay more attention than crash drivers do?
Well, I wouldn't just say police. I mean, there's always that optimism bias that it's called amongst drivers, that I'm a good driver. And this won't happen to me because this only happens to mugs. If you survey 100 people and ask them if you're a good driver, you can bet most of them will say that they are a good driver. So that I suppose it's not just us that could be affected by that, but it is the wider community.
And I'd also just draw on that a bit further as well. Even if you are a great driver and you're trained and this sort of stuff, everyone has their bad days as well. And it just takes something to align on that one day, and you might have done the same journey, same thing every day 100 times over, and it just changes. And all of a sudden, I think it's a Swiss cheese model. Everything lines up, and next minute you're involved in a severe, a harsh crash.
Well, I suppose the example of that would be the late great Peter Brock. Peter Brock, it's been over 10 years since we lost Peter. He was competing in an event in Tasmania, and he was driving I think off the top of my head, a fiberglass type kit car, and he's had a road departure and he's struck a 2,000-year-old tree, and so it's a classic case of the safe system. So you've got a road which is not a safe road, a vehicle which doesn't have the latest safety technology. It is a competitive event, so there was probably a speed factor involved. And one of the greatest race drivers in Australian history loses his life, and that is how easy these things can happen.
Yeah, I remember. I heard about that. His headspace just wasn't quite right in that day, as well.
Yeah, and if you look at Dick Johnson said that when he gave it away because he didn't want to be in that situation.
Excellent. Thanks, Mick. I'll let you move on, mate.
Yeah, no, good stuff. Moving right along. We've talked a bit about vehicles and private vehicles, but there has been quite a lot of work done recently about what they refer to as the grey fleet, and that's the grey fleet is vehicles that are used for work, but they're not provided by the employer. So there could be delivery drivers or contractors. And Austroads, which is the peak organisation of Australasian Road Transport, they have last year issued quite a significant report that looked at the grey fleet. I was speaking recently with a small employer. She was very concerned about where she stands in terms of work health, safety and liability with contractors that use their own vehicles for work. She wanted to know what she could possibly do to encourage her workers to use newer and safer vehicles, and maybe that's something that employers that have a grey fleet can look at. You might ask people, show me evidence that you have a 5-star vehicle before we go any further. Your project, Jerome, you guys have done quite a lot of work in that space as well, haven't you? With your own grey fleet working group.
Yeah, exactly. We had a grey fleet working group that was kicked off at the NRSPP. We brought a range of different industry groups together, and it was quite fascinating. There's one organisation that was part of it, and you can go through the guide. There's a whole lot of case studies, little examples, all real world. And one organisation went from going, I have no grey fleet, to suddenly discovering they got, I think, just over 2 million kilometres they pay out directly to predominantly 18 to 24-year-old young males. So they became very keen in managing that. And I think grey fleet is one area which is quite often just overlooked by a lot of organisations.
Yep, it certainly is. A lot of our government departments, we all have safe driving policies and policies that relate to how we drive vehicles. But coming back to our study, how many times do we actually look at privately owned vehicles? As I said before, go out and have a look in your car park and think about the types of vehicles that are parked out there. You would probably like to think that we have our house in order in terms of safer vehicles, but maybe the same thing can't be said about our own colleagues. Coming back to some of the free text surveys, the top comment there in italics, people talked about ANCAP being able to do more and have more publicity. We've certainly tried to keep this discussion going amongst our people. We have a monthly newsletter, which I actually edit, so I've got free rein over what I put in it, so I can put in plugs for safe systems and safer vehicles, which is good. And the other thing that I probably need to mention is ANCAP recently did highlight the difference in performance amongst vehicles of different age. They did a crash test involving a 2015 Toyota Corolla against the equivalent model from 1998, and they posed the question, who survives? If you haven't looked at that, it's something that's well worth looking at. And obviously the occupant of the older vehicle certainly fared much worse than the occupant of the newer vehicle. We had our own ANCAP-moment at Traffic and Highway Patrol Command a few years ago. Police have obviously traditionally drove Australian-built highway patrol vehicles. Now, that all ended a few years ago when we lost the Holden and Ford from local manufacturing. So we still have some Falcons and Commodores out there, but they're sort of dwindling as time goes by. So the Traffic and Highway Patrol Command, we actually ran a lengthy project in terms of vehicle replacement, and that led us ultimately to BMW, Chrysler, and some Volvos. One of the cars that we looked at was the Ford Mustang. As many people would be aware that Ford started making Mustang and right-hand drive, and it went on sale in about 2016. We did acquire a Mustang as a part of our small fleet of community engagement vehicles, and it was taken to dozens of shows and other community events throughout the state. It was certainly a draw card and a conversation starter, but we did have a look to see if we could expand it for general highway patrol use. However, once they did the ANCAP testing, and it came back with a 2-star rating, we just can't put our people in 2-star cars. In fairness, they have fitted some more advanced safety features to the later models, and the safety rating has gone up. And some of the deficiencies relate to rear seat occupants, and we wouldn't envisage putting somebody in the rear seat of a Mustang, but But as I said, we still really need to look at that ANCAP rating, and if it's not 5-star, it's just not something that we can countenance. Our ultimate project ultimately saw us to select the BMW 530D and the Chrysler SRT. And obviously they're vehicles that were designed, that were selected with safety and also ergonomics. We've done a lot of work in looking at ergonomics. Our highway patrol officers, that's their office. They're sitting in that vehicle for 8-10 hours a day. Over the years, we get from time to time we get injury reports relating to musculoskeletal type injuries, mainly due to sitting for long periods and also getting in and out of cars. So we looked very closely at the subject of ergonomics, and we devised our own ergonomic checklist. So we looked at a number of vehicles, and about 1,000 police over the life of the project filled out checklists on vehicles just to see whether the ergonomics of vehicles were suitable. And it's probably something that companies with large fleets also need to consider. Are the vehicles you're selecting causing you problems in terms of musculoskeletal injuries down the track? So the conclusions, we thought that our house pretty much is in order in terms of safer vehicles. Now, workers do have a greater chance of walking away from a crash rather than being injured. And that's important in terms of organisations losing work time. If your staff get injured in a crash and they're off work, they're hospitalised, that's a cost to your business. You're paying sick leave. You might have to let them go. You might have to train new staff, and they're all costs to business that you really don't need. So if some of our workers through doing this project have gone on to upgrade their cars, then it's a win-win situation for everybody. I was in Melbourne recently where I visited. There's an exhibit called the Road to Zero exhibit down in Melbourne. It's a TAC exhibit. It focuses on achieving this goal of zero deaths and serious injuries through that implementation of that safe system. And part of the interactive exhibit, it talks about safer vehicles, and even I was startled to look at the number of vehicles that are available that under $20,000, under $10,000, and you can even buy safer vehicles that cost less than $5,000 now. And as time goes by, the number of vehicles on the market that fall under that 5-star category will only improve. How safe is your first car.com.au? That's the website. If you haven't looked at it, I really recommend you. It was an eye opener for me. And if you're really in the market for a car, particularly for younger drivers, I'd certainly pay that website a visit, because it will give you the resources and the types of vehicles that you need to look at buying.
Even that commute vehicle as well, because a lot of people have their good car and their commute vehicle, and you can suddenly find, instead of spending $5,000, $8,000 or $10,000 in buying something, you can have a look at that, and you might have something which could change your entire commute journey. That's right.
The other thing, while you're Googling away, I'd also recommend that you Google the review into the National Road Safety Strategy that was released late last year. That was a review that was looking into why nationally we're failing to meet the target set in the National Road Safety Strategy. One of the things it talked about was how road safety needs to be embedded as business as usual within all government departments. Well, I'd go further. I'd say that all organisations, all companies need to bear in mind that road safety is workplace safety. One of the things that I deal with, one of the areas that I also manage, is level crossing safety, and we did some research a little while ago which said that 4 out of every 5 crashes involving a vehicle and a train involved a motor vehicle that was being driven for the purposes of work. So it's 80% of level crossing crashes. It's a work vehicle, a vehicle being driven for work. That's a startling statistic, and that would represent a tremendous cost to businesses.
Quite fascinating to understand that further. But an interesting one to explore.
It is, and when you're looking at hitting a train, obviously the risk of being injured or killed is the consequences can be quite severe. And even if you survive the potential, once you derail a train or you start to rip up track, you're talking about hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of dollars in damage to infrastructure. And I don't think your insurance company would be too happy with you. This slide here shows our new road policing strategy. last year, the government came out with a what they call the Road Safety Plan 2021 for New South Wales. It's a plan that outlines how New South Wales can move towards that future of no deaths and serious injury. So we looked at it in terms of policing and what we can do to help deliver that road safety plan and how we can work towards the reduction of serious injuries. There might be people listening that remember we used to talk about the 3 E's or the 5 E's of road safety. They talked about education and engineering and enforcement. The problem that we found with the E's was that they were too closely aligned to agencies. So there was an expectation that if it was to do with enforcement, it was all our responsibility, and the engineers, the councils and the road authorities were left to do the construction. But the Safe Systems acknowledges that we all have a role to play over the whole spectrum of road safety. So there are aspects that we need to get involved in outside of enforcement, and we need to look beyond the crash to see if there's improvements that can be made in the whole of the network. Local council traffic meetings, for example. Each council has a traffic committee, and police are on that committee, and we really need police to actively take part, just to make sure that the roads are safe roads that are being constructed in people's areas. And I did talk about government fleets and how they tend to be newer. We generally turn our vehicles over every 3 years or so, after which they're auctioned to the public. So as an organisation, that's our opportunity to improve the safety of the used vehicle fleet, to make sure that if we're buying our 5-star rated vehicles, in 3 years when that vehicle goes off to auction, a member of the public can buy it and they're buying a 5-star vehicle as well. And that's one of the contributions that we can make as a police force to safer vehicles. And Jerome, I think we're basically at the end, so I'll hand it back to you.
I think we've got quite a few questions here. I'll go to this one here first from Chris. For new vehicles, what is the legislative requirement for inclusion of safety aspects? Is it purely market driven? How is it that premium sports cars, such as the one you mentioned, can be imported and marketed with such a poor ANCAP rating?
Yeah, look, I think that there has been a lot of talk about whether vehicles should have mandatory safety features. A lot of it has been driven by consumers. Consumers have been lobbying for, and safety groups have been lobbying for improvements. We look at the light truck market with the Hiluxes and the Rangers. The Hilux is now it's been the #1 seller in Australia for a long time, and so has the Ranger's been pretty close behind. Those type of vehicles now dominate the new vehicle sales, but up until fairly recently, some of them have lagged behind in terms of what safety features they offer. So I think manufacturers have listened to that, and they're addressing that now. But it has taken a little bit of time. But there certainly has been. I know of a lot of groups that have called for that. What the questioner has just said, that maybe it's getting to the stage where certain safety features should be mandated. Why is a vehicle sold in country X with these features, but in country Y, particularly if it's a lower or middle income country, why are they selling unsafer vehicles to those markets?
That's a good one. And then question up here, let me just roll up. Okay. Does 5 stars imply that these vehicles have indicators that are visible in bright Australian climates? My experience is that the modern indicators are poorly positioned and illuminated. Would you like to comment, please? Yeah,
sometimes we get questions about headlights and indicators. That's obviously not something that we can control as a state police force. Some manufacturers probably put a bit more thought into those things than others. That's probably about all I can say.
Fair enough. Question here. Let me just roll down. Here we go. Recently, Uber Australia announced a 5-star ANCAP policy. Thoughts as to why the taxi industry hasn't gone down this path previously as well?
Yeah, it's a good question. And that's, I suppose, part of that grey fleet that we're talking about. Safety in cabs. It's interesting because there was requirements up until fairly recently that cabs had to be newer vehicles, but a lot of that is, I think a lot of that's gone out the window now. That used to be in New South Wales that you could only have a vehicle that was less than 6 years old, but some of those things have been laxed. And it's an interesting question. not one that I can answer.
Actually, and there's one I just learned the other day about, I guess, the complexity of the levels of alcohol in an Uber driver versus a taxi driver. Would you like to talk about that quickly?
Yeah, we were talking the other day about drivers and the taxis. It's pretty easy to identify a taxi, and they obviously, as professional drivers, they have a requirement of 0.02, and well, that applies to Uber drivers and the other people driving professionally. But actually, for us to actually identify a vehicle that's being driven as a ride share, that can sometimes be a bit of a challenge for us.
Question here from Lisa. She'd like to know what sort of things were there on your ergonomics list? Yes.
Oh, we've looked at egress and ingress, whether it's easy to get in and out of a vehicle. Some of the vehicles, trying to get in and out of them is very difficult. Obviously, for us too, we have a gun belt, so we have other factors there. So is the seat comfortable? Do we have the handcuffs pouches that digging into us? The placement of the steering wheel, having a look if it's on center, how much adjustment is there, making sure there's rake and reach adjustment, visibility, and also in the boot of the vehicle, how hard is it to load the boot of the vehicle, because we quite often have to get stuff in and out of our cars. So something with a lower sill is probably preferable to us, and something that's got a very high lip, and we have to lift stuff over. So they're the types of things. It was quite a comprehensive checklist.
That's great. Would that be able to be made public at all, or is that just internal, Mick?
Well, that was something that we used internally, but it was something that I had to spend quite a lot of time researching, because there wasn't a lot of stuff actually out there on it. So yeah, I feel your pain in looking at that, but we did develop it for our internal use. As I said, we did look at factors that related to policing, and that was a lot of it related to our uniform and making sure everything was accessible.
Question here from John, I think looking to draw on your expertise in dealing with level crossings. The biggest factor is train frontal design. That's never been mentioned before. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I know they've talked about should they be yellow, should they have other lights, and a lot of the issues in terms of level crossing safety it comes back to it's what they call inattention blindness, where the motorist looks but did not see. So they just either fail to see a train approaching or misjudge the speed that the train's travelling at. A lot of our crashes at level crossings happen in broad daylight, and I suppose you scratch your head and wonder why sometimes, but there's a lot of human factors work that's looking into that.
Police vehicles are typically modified to suit their purpose. How do you think that impacts the overall safety of these vehicles?
Oh, look, we do fit radios and we fit other equipments to the vehicles, but they have to get them certified by engineers. We can't just fit equipment in our vehicles wherever we like. They go through quite an testing process. That, for argument's sake, we can't put something in the police vehicle that would interfere with the operation of an airbag, for example.
Great. One here from Corey. On the strategy slide, it mentions Strike Force Puma identifying high-risk drivers. Are they just using lagging indicators incidents as indicators of risk, or are they looking at leading indicators?
No, I'm not quite sure what he means by that, I have to say.
Pumas is,
yeah.
And another one here from Tony. What's your opinion, Mick, on why are we not on the right path to meeting our national state road safety strategies? Would you agree the involvement of humans being prone to human error, that we are maybe some way off reaching towards zero?
Well, certainly a lot of it does come down to human factors, which is why ultimately, if we can pull this safe systems concept off, acknowledging that people do make mistakes, but having a road environment that's forgiving. Just come back to that exhibit down in Melbourne, the Road to Zero exhibit, where it talks about how it gives you there's some different workstations. There's one where you can look at a vehicle hitting a pole at 30, at 50, at 70, and the difference in impact severity and obviously outcome. There's a lot of factors around why a lot of places aren't meeting their targets. It's probably an issue for another day.
All right. Last couple of questions. One here from Corey again. just referring to the empowerment of the vehicle with ABS and those sort of items. What about sufficient training for the safety inclusion? As no one reads or understands the manuals, what can we do more to understand what the actual technology can do?
Yeah, it's when we introduced our latest generation of highway patrol vehicles, we had our fleet section did produce quite an extensive guide for our members, which is widely disseminated. So we just had to make sure that our people actually knew what the features were. He does touch on a pretty good point that I suppose it probably depends on the quality of your vehicle sales. But I know last time my wife bought a new car, they spent quite a lot of time going through those features, but the people really need to understand what they do, and because you can be confronted with a chime or a warning that you might be unfamiliar with, and if you're unfamiliar with it, then you're probably more likely to try to deactivate it.
And to your detriment, I must admit.
Yes.
And our closing sort of question here before I have one more to go to you, one from Andrew. And this may be a bit of a difficult one for you as well. It'd be interesting to know how you sort of communicate with your peers in other states. Are all state governments adopting this sort of safer vehicle strategy and getting suitable vehicles into their fleet? Because in Queensland, we have Ford Rangers, Toyota Prados and Land Cruisers.
Yeah, look, most states are moving towards safer systems, certainly Victoria, Queensland, other places. As for what the government departments do, I suppose it's a matter for individual government departments, but certainly in terms of New South Wales, I come back to that national review of the National Road Safety Strategy, and it says road safety needs to be embedded as business as usual. And if you take nothing else away from the point, certainly take that away in your own businesses and your own workplaces, that workplace safety is road safety.
Mm. I just had one slide in at the 11th hour just then from George. Whilst delivering a safer driving course yesterday, a student at a local high school, I was asked why highway patrol officers use mobile phones instead of two-ways. Can you shed any light on this, please?
Well, we obviously still use radios, but there is an exemption under the road rules for police to use mobile phones. It's not something that we encourage, and in fact, our internal comms policies do discourage it. There might be times when it's necessary, but I wouldn't be it's widespread. The question seems to be predicated that we're using mobile phones a lot, and if that's the premise, I'd repudiate that.
Right. And Elise is asking one here just around vehicle modifications of other cars on the road. And I guess just in your personal experience, have you seen whether there's an impact of these in road accidents at all?
Yeah, look, it's probably not something I could just answer off the top of my head. It's interesting. I often talk about what the next generation of modified vehicles is going to look like. We saw there was a few years ago there was some guys in the US. They hacked into a Jeep as it was driving along, and they started activating some of the features. And I think that's probably the type of thing as we move towards autonomy. That's probably the next generation of vehicle modifications, is people that will try to override speed governors and things like that.
Great. And I guess my closing question to you, Mick, what would be your take-home message, or the one thing you'd like to leave everyone with?
Look, have a look in your car park. Have a look at the types of vehicles that your people are driving. As I said, our private vehicle fleet probably represents more than 2,000 vehicles. If you can encourage your people to go home and have the discussion about safer vehicles, then it's a win-win situation for everybody.
Thank you very much. If you just go to our closing slide now, please, Mick. And I'd like to take the time just to thank you very much to Mick and the New South Wales Police Force. I think this is a fantastic example of leadership. Next month, we have a bit of leadership from Nestle as we release their case study, which touches on how they've been engaging their workforce around driver distraction. So thank you very much for being part of today's webinar, Mick.
Thanks, Jerome. It's been a pleasure, and I really commend you for doing these webinars. And obviously, even just looking at this next one, the Nestle, and the previous one with Australia Post, these are aimed at practitioners and people that are actually delivering outcomes for their businesses. And it's something that we need in road safety. We just definitely need to see more of.
Excellent. And of course, thank you to our audience for all being part of today's session and asking so many great, different and varied questions. I look forward to talking to you in the future in our future webinars. Thank you again.